Good morning. I'm Pamela Ferdinand with US Right to Know, here to talk about some of the commercial determinants of health as part of our new project, HealthWire. Those are private sector activities that impact your health. And certainly today I'm talking to people who can tell us about either a marriage made in heaven or a marriage made in hell. And that's ultra-processed foods and plastics. Why those two subjects and why together did you decide to look at them?
Thanks, Pamela. Lovely to be here. Really like the work that you do at US Right to Know. Well, I think essentially we come from different backgrounds, different disciplines, experts on this paper. And I think independently, we've all seen the rise of ultra-processed foods and the rise of plastics as independent problems that are creating significant challenges around the world. And that coming together from different disciplines and expertise, you can see also how they are intimately linked and how they are codependent on one another, and how that the way in which plastics have been kept artificially cheap has been a major factor driving the expansion of ultra-processed cheap and artificial. So I think that was one of the driving forces, and also that we were able to see that because of these issues have been somewhat studied separately or tried to be addressed separately by policymakers, there are some important areas that haven't been identified in those different policy domains that would lend extra weight to the way that they could be addressed. And we think that by addressing them together, there can be some really effective potential policy actions that could, improve the lives of people and the health of our planet.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a bit about each of your disciplines and how you are bringing them together in this way?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just share how we actually started collaborating. I was at the Global Plastics Treaty negotiations a year and a half ago in Paris. This is an ongoing process right now at the United Nations, where the world's nations come together because they recognize that there's such a huge problem with plastics. And so we're negotiating, or the countries are negotiating a treaty to end plastic pollution, which will be similar like the Paris Agreement for climate. That's sort of the dimension of this. And so as an observer, as an independent scientist, I've been involved in this process. And at a side event in Paris, I spoke, and then Joe came running up to me after and said, "We need to talk." Right, Joe? And so that was in May last year. And so we got together many times since then. We've been chatting back and forth, but it became pretty obvious quite clearly that we're both very interested in food and health, and that there's a key link to plastics. And you hear people talk about plastics as being the workhorse of our economy. I would say it's much more than that in the food system. It's an enabler. It's an enabler of unhealthy food products, or as Carlos Montero would say, edible substances. It's not even food. So my background is in environmental science, environmental chemistry, environmental toxicology. I'm the managing director of the Food Packaging Forum, which is an independent research organization based in Switzerland, in Zurich. And for 17 years, I've been studying chemicals in what we call food contact materials. So this is food packaging, but it's also all the processing equipment. And that's actually a source of these chemicals that's flying under the radar, because meanwhile, people know that, chemicals in plastic bottles can leach into food, but those chemicals can also leach when foods are being processed, when they're being extruded and, treated with high pressure processing and so on and so forth. And all of these processing steps can also be a source of these chemicals. So that's kind of the background that I bring in here.
That's great. Stuart?
Yeah, maybe just to say a few words about my own background. I've been working for 40 years in food, nutrition, and health. I started in the early 80s, and it was very much a focus on undernutrition, very much issues around hunger, child hunger, and a lot of work in Asia. Lived in India for quite a while then. Worked a lot with the UN, and then I spent 22 years with IFPRI, International Food Policy Research Institute. And I worked way back with Carlos Montero in when was it, early 90s, and Carlos was writing a case study, and obviously he's a co-author, and you know Carlos from his work on UPFs, but he was writing a case study on the reasons for the success in driving down stunting in Brazil. But as he was writing that, he was talking also about this sort of, he was worried about what was on the horizon in Brazil in the early mid-90s, with the rise in the availability of junk food, basically, and that's where he was moving in that direction. When I was working with IFPRI, I was increasingly looking at malnutrition in all forms, obviously overweight and obesity, as well as undernutrition, which required me to really engage with the commercial determinants of malnutrition more broadly. And that made me do kind of my own crash course on political economy, commercial drivers, and I ended up leaving IFPRI through written a book called, which industry has repeatedly is my internet working? Is it? Can you hear me?
Yeah, it froze for a second.
You can.
You're
Sorry,
good
it
now.
just said it was so the way in which industry has interfered with policy, but also the games that are played, the tactics that are used to drive increasing consumption of processed foods just across the world. We had colonialism, as now we're in a different form of colonialism. And I really like the word that Jane just used, enabler, in terms of the way plastics are an enabler for the UPF industry to do these things. It has multiple. It ticks so many boxes for industry in that way. And Joe in his paper talked about the symbiosis. There is this symbiosis, and therefore we, on the one hand, there's kind of this vicious cycle, or many vicious cycles in this arena. But on the one hand, that presents challenges, but it also presents potential benefits, the co-benefits of addressing plastic pollution and the ways in which industry try to promote plastics. The ways in which we oppose that can be used in terms of opposing the health harms attached to the products which are being shrouded in plastic. So these two things go together in many ways, which means that we need to address them together synergistically.
I know this is a vast topic, but if I could ask you to kind of talk about what those health harms are and why they're enhanced by coupling plastics with ultra-processed foods. Joe?
So maybe I can start on the chemical
Yeah.
side of things. So we have actually surprisingly large knowledge gaps in terms of how plastic chemicals affect health. You would think that packaging that's been on the market for 50, sometimes 60 years has been thoroughly tested and that we've got very solid data sets. Well, that is not the case, unfortunately. But there are a handful of chemicals where we do know how they impact human health. And many of these well-established links point to endocrine disruption as being one of the mechanisms. So these are chemicals that can, in a way, hijack the body's hormone system. That's the endocrine system. And they either prevent the action of hormones, or they amplify, or they completely distort that. And they do that at extremely low levels, because that's how hormones work. Hormones work at very, very low levels. And so one of these chemicals is bisphenol A, for which we have extremely robust evidence of how it impacts health. And I'm just pulling out my cheat sheet here because I don't want to give you wrong information. But basically, what bisphenol A does, it taps into the metabolic system. So it's been causally linked to type 2 diabetes. Plausibly, and also in epidemiological studies, cardiovascular disease in children and adults, insulin resistance, obesity in children and adults, and then also reproductive disorders like polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is a disease that affects females, women, fertility. And then there's the phthalates, which have been linked to miscarriage, low birth weight, high blood pressure, asthma, early puberty, lower IQ, cognitive development impairments, low sperm count, poor sperm quality, and endometriosis. And so that's just, for 2 types of chemicals. Now, as Joe said, there's 16,000 plastic chemicals that we know of, at least. There's probably many, many more. And we have no information on the way that they affect health. And just briefly, another issue linked to plastics are micronanoplastics, which are produced during the normal and intended use of plastic food contact materials. So, any form of abrasion, for example, mechanical stress, but also heat treatment will lead to migration of these micronanoplastics. And here, the knowledge is even sketchier than for chemicals. But what we're seeing is that there may be impacts on the immune system and maybe also even on cancers. So that's the plastic side. And then, of course, we've got all the health impacts linked to food, right? So the ultra-processed food.
Joe or Stuart, would you like to address that?
Yeah, I think, Stuart, you might be best placed on the nutrition food side.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are, I don't know how many studies, hundreds of studies that have shown in different ways. Often these are observational, so they're showing associations. It's hard to disentangle, but they are controlled for many factors. But they've showed the ways in which overconsumption of ultra-processed foods can generate a range of harms, from cardiovascular mortality, obesity, diabetes, actually also increasingly issues around dementia. And it's interesting, a lot of work is now going on at the root cause of some of these may be inflammation. And we know that inflammation is linked to many chronic diseases. It's not just the high levels of fat, salt, sugar, saturated fats, salt and sugar. There's something up and beyond that in the ultra processing itself. We don't exactly know what it is. There are various mechanisms, so we have a certain degree of uncertainty as to the mechanisms that relate to that extra harm, if you like. But it may be to do with the fact it's low in fiber, low in protein, that there may be issues around emulsifiers, for example, affecting the microbiome. There is issues around signaling between the brain and the gut in terms of satiety. With regard to sodas and foods, soda has been implicated in disrupting that mechanism whereby your brain signals you've had enough to eat. So there are these kind of combinations of facts, but a lot of this work has been summarized recently in systematic reviews. Because we don't know, it's no reason not to do anything. Because we don't know of the extra harms related to ultra processing per se, over and above nutrient composition, is no reason to stand back and wait for that kind of research to be done. We have to adopt the precautionary principle at this level, given the mass exposure across the world. And that's the other side of this, is the way these industries are operating now a lot in Africa. They move through Europe, North America, Europe, Asia, Latin America, and now increasingly in Africa, where there is virtually no regulation. And we know the damage that's being caused and the rise in overweight and obesity. So there are multiple issues around the harms of the foods per se. And then on top of that, you have the fact that they're shrouded in plastics, which cause massive environmental harms. And some of the statistics, I'm not sure if these were in your in the commentary that we had, but McDonald's, for example, generate 1 billion kilograms of plastic packaging, which is the weight of 100 Eiffel Towers every year. There are 34 billion plastic bottles floating around in the oceans in any one year, which is about 4 to 5 for every person on the planet. You know, and then historically you've gone through a situation of colonial extraction in lower income countries, and now we're getting a dumping of the waste from these industries that have been in the past extracting from these countries and are now dumping waste. And there's a massive amount of plastic dumping in Africa, which ends up causing all sorts of problems environmentally. Sorry, I'm rambling on a bit beyond health, but there's a lot of interconnections in all this, which means that, as I say, there are potentials for turning vicious cycles into virtuous cycles, if you like, and generating co-benefits of taking on both the health side and the environmental side.
Yeah. Joe, can you talk about taking both of those on, and what is the warning that this paper is messaging?
Yeah, I mean, just to quickly say one more thing on health as well, is that what we've been talking about here is largely the direct impacts of these products, but I think it's also really important, and what we've tried to stress a little bit in the paper, is that before they even come into contact with consumers, plastics have already contributed to a whole range of detrimental health outcomes. From, you know, they come from a petrochemical industry and a fossil fuel industry which is subsidized annually to the tune of billions, in some cases, according to some analyses, trillions. And the extraction, the processing, the refining of these plastics, and the huge quantities of diverse chemicals, some known, many unknown, as Jane has said, that are poured into these processes, lead to harms, environmental harms, that are then go on to human health harms before they even come into contact with consumers. And on the food side, the ultra processed food side, also a lot of the raw ingredients of ultra processed foods are produced through forms of industrial agriculture, which involve, you know, as you know, lots of pesticides, heavy inputs, and as we've demonstrated a little bit in the paper, a lot of also plastics, you know, plastic encapsulated fertilizers and so forth. So there's other indirect health outcomes that are related to this production and supply of these. And then, of course, what Stuart said is the end of their life, you know, what they go on to do. But in terms of the warning and what we're trying to call for here is we're trying to say that we cannot wait for these issues to gain prominence, as we have waited for other issues to gain prominence. I mean, we use the example of food in the climate debate. You know, we see that it's taken so long for agriculture and food to be truly recognized as one of the major drivers, or this form of agriculture and food production as a major driver of climate change and all the ill health outcomes that come with that, is that we don't want to see the same mistakes happening with plastics and ultra processed foods. They are so obviously and clearly dependent on one another. There's an opportunity here, and as Stuart said, and as James said, there's such exposure and growing exposure across the global population that time is really not on our side here, and in some cases, you know, as has been demonstrated in some early economic analyses of the impacts of just some chemicals that are related to plastics and just some of the dietary non-communicable disease related impacts, these costs are mounting on public health budgets rapidly. So as we're calling on policymakers to see these problems as linked, as to think about the ways that they can tackle them together, whether it's in food policy or whether it's on regulating chemicals. One of the key things that Jane's put forward in particular is around food safety standards and testing. How is it that populations are exposed to chemicals that even the industries using them don't know about, don't have a full knowledge of? Sometimes they don't even know what's in the plastics, let alone whether they've been tested to what we would, you know, what we would say is a safe and sustainable standard. And maybe Jane can say some more on that, but that's a whole area which is very concerning.
Yeah, I think that's all absolutely spot on and really, really important. And you know, I think the point also is people oftentimes get accused of, you know, like, well, you're making the wrong choices. You know, you buy these foods, it's your own problem, it's your own fault. Well, that is just simply not true, because basically ultra processed foods are engineered to be addictive. And we have addiction on the level of individuals, but basically the whole society and our economic system in a way also is addicted to plastics as enablers of these unhealthy business models and unhealthy products. And so the first step in addiction treatment is to acknowledge that you have a problem, right? So instead of seeing more PR and more marketing being pumped out on how important these plastics are because they prevent food waste and what have you not, we need to really have an honest conversation that we have a problem. Our planet is at the brink, I would say, of losing its stability that we've had over the last 10,000 or so years in the Holocene. We have the planetary boundaries concept that scientists have developed to show policymakers that, you know, we're risking the stability of our environmental system, which has enabled humanity to grow and blossom over these 10,000 years. And we're going into chaos. You know, I mean, how many hurricanes hit Florida in the last, you know, so this is our future and amplified even more. And so, you know, talk about food safety in that kind of environment, right? So I think we need to acknowledge we have a problem, and it is amplified by the use of plastics and the production of these ultra-processed foods. And you know, we're not saying that we have all the solutions here, but I think there's 4 things that we want to highlight with this publication. First, and maybe the most important one, being that we shouldn't continue on this path of fighting symptoms. As we've done for climate change way too long and for other issues, we need to look at the problem in a sort of much more holistic context and then not shoot for the quick, easy, simple solutions, which don't exist for complex problems, but to find responses and interventions that acknowledge the complexity of the issue at hand, right? So not fight ultra-processed foods, or maybe to make it even simpler, not pretend to improve food by reducing sugar content. That's not the point here, you know? So that, I think, is a really important message for policymakers. Acknowledge the complexity and don't fall for simple solutions, because those will become tomorrow's problems. And in the same light, we need interdisciplinary research. So, you know, we come together as researchers with very different backgrounds. It's difficult to work together because we don't speak the same language. We have different sort of, you know, ways to approach our scientific work. We need to get out of our comfort zones and also involve other stakeholders, you know, not just cozy up within the walls of academia. As Joe already mentioned, we need to work together to identify what are the essential uses of plastics and what are the sort of safe and sustainable criteria. But also maybe for the business models that are producing foods, you know. So one thing that I like to think about is innovation is great, but innovation should be based in terms of what society needs, and it should be in terms of what is safe and sustainable for society. We shouldn't just encourage innovation for the sake of innovation, because then we create the next problem. Now we're dealing with vapes, you know, or we'll be dealing with some other artificial food. And then the last point, which I really am not an expert on, but I know Stuart and Joe are these commercial determinants of health. How can we rein in these business models that are really manipulating people into addiction and overconsumption? I think that's a big challenge.
Stuart, do you want to address that? Oh, he might be frozen. Joe?
Yeah, I mean, on the final point, I think as Jane says, recognizing these commercial drivers of these challenges, and in recognizing them, also ensuring that they are at arm's length in processes that are designed to regulate them. Well, we see this with, for instance, the Plastics Treaty. It's well documented. There's a lot of industry walking around in and around the Plastics Treaty negotiations. from the food industry, from petrochemical industry. We see it in various other, so-called multi-stakeholder initiatives or forums as well, where often the drivers, or at least the contributors to some of these problems, are also involved in some of the responses, formulating the responses. So we also caution here to say, if we recognize they're part of the problem, then logically we should be careful about their involvement in certain elements of, trying to find a way out of this problem. Yeah. I think Stuart's just tried to.
Maybe he'll join by
Yeah,
audio.
unfortunately, his audio is,
Oh, that's too bad.
it's going.
Yeah.
Do another chat with
Fine.
him.
I don't, can you hear me? I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I'm in a hotel
Great.
room.
No worries. We can hear you.
Uh, Sorry, I was just saying I'm in a hotel room and I got lousy Wi-Fi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, just one thing that maybe just to add to what Jane said. Innovation is it's an interesting concept in this world, and what we have a problem, which is that innovation follows the evolutionary logic of a system, and the system what we have is one that generates profits from selling ultra processed foods. So you're going to get technical innovations, not social innovations. And what we need is social innovations that put primacy on improving the access and affordability of healthy diets especially for low-income families and households. That's the kind of innovation that we need, and that's what's not obviously incorporated in the business models of these big food industries. And therefore, it's no good just trying to find a way of technologically tinkering in the margins to, improve nutrient profiles of some of these foods, because the entire modus operandi of the industry is to displace healthy foods with these kind of products. And so I think we need to be careful when we use innovation, which isn't fine because it just means something new, something different, but we need to focus on the issues of equity and affordability of healthy diets.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more with you, Stuart. I think, and I'm really, maybe I shouldn't be talking about economics, since I really am not an economist, but profits basically that's the sort of the way economists think about it. Profits are generated by capital and labor, right? And if you think about labor, that's people, and people need time to do things, right? And so we always have to do everything faster and faster and faster. That's kind of the logic of the current system. So that's kind of the way how ultra-processed foods grow in their profit margins, by cutting corners, reducing the cost of labor by reducing people time, basically. So it's all about convenience, and it's all about these, kinds of business models. And it's also convenience for people, that we don't need so much time to prepare foods. And I think the way out of the current system really is to embrace inconvenience. And I call it happiness in inconvenience, actually. Which is also based on sort of neuroscience research that shows us you can actually, by challenging yourself, do something difficult, it increases your dopamine. So what we need is more inconvenience in our food behavior, I think, and that maybe results in cooking more, doing more cooking yourself, buying food from scratch, maybe even growing your own food, or being part of a co-op that grows your own food, having reusable containers that you bring back because they have a deposit on them. So it's all these what Stuart calls social innovations. It's behavioral change, and it's conscious consumption. And I firmly believe that will be linked to better health in many different ways, but on the individual level, but also on the planetary level.
You talk in the paper too about the problems, but also that there's kind of a window of opportunity now, partly with the global plastics treaty negotiations, although it's hard to tell what's actually going to come out of that. Can you talk a little bit about why why the time to strike now is so opportune, apart from the urgency of the problem.
Joe, I don't know if you want to speak about that.
Well, I can just say a few words, but then pass it on. I think for both of these issues, we've seen public recognition of them reach a point, almost, I would say, a tipping point where it would be impossible for policymakers not to respond to their citizens' concern. And as we've heard, because of the ubiquity of ultra-processed foods and of plastics that are associated with ultra-processed foods across society, it really renders almost everyone impacted at some point. It becomes quite difficult to avoid them in some settings. And as we've heard from Jane as well and Stuart, like the modern global economy, many of the other areas of the economy leave us in situations where we have to do things quickly. There's a lot of it's important to mention that a lot of subgroups in society also have limitations on their time, on their expenses and so forth, and are therefore forced into these eating, these habits and these dietary choices. And really they're not consenting to be exposed to this level and constant chronic exposure to what's intentionally in these foods and what's unintentionally finding their way into it. So I think the growing public recognition has reached a point where I think it's going to be difficult for politicians to not do anything. We've seen today, for instance, in the UK, there's just been a big report for our government in the House of Lords on national food policy. It looks cool. I've only had a brief look at it, but it looks tentatively like it might be pointing towards a better direction than we've had for some time. And there's growing calls in the US, I know, and around the world for better regulation. Yeah, we have the plastics treaty, and notwithstanding what comes out of there, no one knows, as you say. But even just getting to the point of having a plastics treaty has brought together momentum and policymakers in the global community in a way which we couldn't have imagined 10 years ago or 5 years ago. And actually, that momentum will continue, I think, whatever happens with the plastics treaty at sort of national, supranational. There's city level action, like you see climate change. I think there's momentum happening now, and this is the time to tap into it. But as we've called for, and as Jane and Stuart mentioned, we need the researchers to join hands to provide the evidence that is needed by policymakers to guide those decisions. And we also need policymakers to see that this is a multi-sectoral problem.
Yeah, and I think sometimes the universe connects the dots in these ways. It's just these emerging issues where, as Stuart said before, with the impacts of ultra-processed foods on health, that you cannot explain all those health impacts only by looking at the food. So one hypothesis there is that it's the chemicals that leach from the processing equipment, or a combination of the novel processing methods that change the chemistry of the food and generates new chemical substances which have impacts on health. So that's research that people are starting to study now. In general, our society is very much interested in health. So as you said at the beginning of our conversation, Pamela, we're in the business of saving lives. I mean, that's what we feel very strongly compelled to do. We have a moral obligation because we know these things. And by the same token, I also think, like Joe said, with the process of the United Nations Plastics Treaty, it's been a fantastic platform to educate important people, decision makers on these issues, and they cannot unknow or unsee what they've seen now. And people care about health. So I do think it's really a terrific opportunity to talk about impacts on health, not only from plastics, but also from the unhealthy business models that they enable.
If I could maybe close with asking each of you to kind of make a call to action, one specific thing you think people could do today to help make a difference on this path, small or large.
Well, I think, understand the science. educate yourself. Don't just kind of accept as fact what people tell you, especially if they have a vested interest, as the food industry has. So be critical about the sources of your information. And then a very practical thing you can do is just don't put hot food in contact with plastic. You know, if you have an electric kettle that is made with plastic on the inside, then literally throw it away. Get rid of it. Don't use those black spatulas, plastic spatulas in your kitchen. Try and eat real food. You know, the less processed your food is when it gets onto your plate, the better for your health.
Yeah. Joe and Stuart?
Maybe, can you hear me? Sorry
Yeah.
about, yeah, great. So I'll keep my video off. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to, I always find it hard to talk about one specific thing, but I do think there are massive issues around the interference by industry in terms of policy and policy processes. I think we have to call out conflicts of interest, and we're doing that, and that has an impact with when that is done. There are games being played with regard to very small scale so-called corporate social responsibility initiatives, greenwashing. We all know about greenwashing. We have nutri-washing. We have all sorts of washing, corporate laundry, to deflect and distract from the bigger picture. And the bigger picture are the business models that continue to generate harm. And I think, again, shining a light on these games and these kind of shenanigans that are played out. Joe mentioned a report just released today by the House of Lords in the UK. I was surprised by that because that is harder hitting than I expected. I haven't read it all. It's 180 odd pages, obviously, and I'm on holiday. But it's interesting. It's calling for mandatory regulation. We know that voluntary regulation absolutely does not work. It's shooting down this concept of the nanny state. And showing the fallacy in invoking that as a reason not to do anything. We know that the nanny state concept is being developed by industry to make this to generate this notion of freedom. But the real freedom is a freedom on the part of especially low-income families to access an affordable, healthy diet. That is what we should be thinking about in terms of freedom. And when you have those diets being displaced by ultra-processed foods, that's what we have to challenge. And I think, and the final thing I will say is children. We need to keep an eye on children, always be asking questions about not only our children or our children's children, but looking further down the line in the next 2 generations and thinking about what world are we helping to create for them in terms of the future. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. And Joe?
Yeah, I think to build on what's been said, I think lots of small acts can come together to do something quite big. I think talking to people, informing yourself, as Jane said, and talking to people, talking to your friends, your family, telling them what you know. That day I saw Jane presenting on this, it was like, wow, okay. I come from a food nutrition background, and now I'm seeing this, and it was like a huge moment in my life. And so I've passed it on, but it comes with a responsibility as well. Telling people about these things which can be scary or unavoidable, which is probably the most frustrating thing I find, is that I'm going to tell someone something which is they can't do much about because they're ubiquitously exposed to many of these plastics and chemicals. But doing it in a way where they feel motivated to sort of join the fight to do something about it. There's lots of things we as members of the public can do. We can write to our MPs, we can add to the pressure. You don't have to be a scientist or a politician to make change. But the one thing I would say is to whatever you're reading, try and make sure it's conflict of interest free, and look at the acknowledgements on a scientific paper to see where that science has come from, because that very well could dictate what exactly you're reading and what you might take home and then tell your friends.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's important to sort out the truth from the fictions. Thank you so much. Please follow our coverage of commercial determinants of health at usrt2k.org/healthwire. We will certainly be following your work, and I so appreciate your time today. And please, we'll post some links to your paper as well so people can read that directly.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Pamela.
Thank you so much, Pamela.